And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. This is going to be an interesting episode. My guest is David Weitzner from Canada. He has a joint PhD in strategy and ethics, as well as an MBA in arts and media management, and of course, a BA in philosophy. So this is this is going to be a blast. David's the co-author of a new book called Connected Capitalism, how Jewish wisdom can transform work. So he's got a lot of other accomplishments and publications and all that sort of fun stuff as well. He lives in Toronto and is currently feeling not great because of the second vaccine. So congratulations for feeling crappy.
That's right. Look, dude, it's anything that I'll have to do to get back across the border. I miss New York and LA and San Fran and the rest of the US. If I need the vax, I'll do it.
Exactly. We're worth being vaxxed for, I hope. So cool. So talk a little bit about, so you're if we have to put you in a category, it's academic, right? And I love the eclectic blend of your education that just shows up on this, from philosophy to MBA in media management. So that means you have the business sense, and then the PhD in strategy and ethics, which I think is probably more closely related to the book, right? So give me the gist of what the book is and how it relates to the world.
So the version of the book, really, the journey, is it started with my last book. So my last book was called 15 Paths. And the tagline of that book was a disillusioned business professor reaching out to his artistic heroes for guidance. And so I spent a year talking to the rock stars that I love and adore and other artists who are really entrepreneurs. And their approach to business is different. And I spent a year learning from them. And then we were having an event actually in New York City. It was actually an event in Brooklyn with Lee Ronaldo of Sonic Youth and Nels Klein of Wilco. And we started talking. And what came out in the discussion is that it was spirituality, and we'll define it carefully soon, but it was really spirituality that motivates their business, their approach to entrepreneurship, the way they started thinking about business. And it sort of clicked that I was skirting the real topic I wanted to cover. I was talking to artists because it's safe to talk about art and creativity, but spirituality is a bit of a taboo, except for what I realized is our definition of spirituality, which is a sense of meaning, connection, and wonder, is already there in the business world. It's already there in the business research. We know these things are important, but we were afraid to call it that. Instead,
stay there for a second, because if we were to talk to an artist, a poet, a musician, or whatever, no problem talking about that. What drives you? What got you to, something came to me and then the song poured out of me, et cetera, right? But, the last meeting I'm in, and I don't say this anymore, that was a pretty good presentation in the deck. And it's, well, yeah, it just sort of came to me. And I was just the vessel to, vomit forth 87 slides in a power. That's not how we roll in business. But you're saying it sort of is.
But it is, right? It is. It's what we call innovation. That's what, and the tech guys and gals aren't afraid to use that language. That's really where I got, a lot of my inspiration from. A lot of the folks who I interview in the book are in the tech sector, where they're not afraid to use this sort of terminology and to really play off book. There's an interview in the book where I talk with someone who explains that in his consulting practice, he abandons a product map, right? So the customer hires him to do X, says, I want you to do ABC, comes back a year later, hasn't done any of that, but shows them what they have created. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. He's like, yeah, that's just where the inspiration was. And we do that. We're accepting that in the tech world. I mean, even us regular folks.
But is it because the tech world is so forward looking? There's a sense of, not all technologies, obviously, but visionary, taking you where we haven't been before, being able to connect people in new and creative ways, the all that stuff. So there is a bit of
yes, but I think it's because they're in an acknowledged disruptive environment, so they have the leeway. Right now, we're all in that disruptive environment. I'll give you an easy example, right? So Cura Events, an LA-based company, they made the tents for the Coachella Music Festival. And once the pandemic hit, they had to pivot quickly. And they pivoted to creating hospital tents.
Okay.
And it's that same sort of moment of inspiration, whereas if it wasn't for the pandemic, they would have stayed in their box, right? But that pandemic hit, they said, oh my, our business model's in trouble. Well, can we do something that's meaningful, that's socially important? Yeah, we have the tacit knowledge. Let's pivot and make these tents to help in the crisis. And so it's not just the tech world right now, I think, post-pandemic, that are going to be called on to rethink and be forward-looking and innovative.
Mhm.
I think it's all sectors. So I think the time's
So,
right to take that thinking forward.
so when you talk about connected capitalism, how is that similar and probably at the same time a bit different than the things we're currently familiar with, conscious capitalism and ESG, and
Yeah,
there's this
yeah.
whole, I mean, and that's not even sort of fringe anymore. That's moving closer and closer and closer every day to mainstream.
I think that there's many ways that it's different, but I think one of the most important ones is there's this idea in conscious capitalism or ESG that essentially you're doing well by doing good, right? That's the model. And the data doesn't support that. There isn't a positive correlation between increased profitability and doing the right thing. We know that now. And so if that's the push, I think it's ultimately not going to work long term. And it's not particularly interesting to me because it's also, in general, giving specific normative principled guidance, right? It's latching onto an issue
Mhm.
and saying, I'm going to move on this. What I'm pushing is something different. What I'm pushing is saying, if we bring this connected mindset, the spiritual mindset to the workplace, then actually your day-to-day business activities are themselves ethical. So in other words, under conscious capitalism, you have to do good in the
Mhm.
classic sense. In my model, if you're innovating, that's a moral good. If you've created a new financial product, that's a moral good. In other words, the activities that we don't usually label as moral become moral if you're doing it under the guidance of meaning, connection, and wonder.
But what if I'm innovating? Juul was an innovation in nicotine delivery, so that's good.
So it's very
I'm playing
interesting,
with you a
right?
little bit here, but
Well, I'll push back on that. I'll say this. I'll say when they innovated, their hope was that they would undo some of the harm around traditional tobacco consumption. So at the time of founding, I will say it was a good. Now we know it has its own health problems and its own addictive properties. And so to continue the business model today would be problematic. But I wouldn't have viewed them as immoral or problematic at their moment of founding. And there could be, in another world, a social good in a product like that, you know?
okay, cool. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So, we're living in an age now were things that were literally sort of chiseled in stone of the business school. Milton Friedman, where the purpose of business is to make money. Now you hear CEOs of Fortune 100s, not like Ben and Jerry, two stoner dudes talking about it, but
Right.
like Fortune 50 CEOs going, well, I think Friedman was wrong. I'm like, I want to get a refund for my economics degree from the 80s because that's what it was all about, right?
Right.
And that's not just PR. What's driving that? Is that sort of the connectedness?
So it is. There's a few things going on here, and some of them are, I would say, are more controversial to acknowledge them. Some of them are easier. One thing that I think is less controversial is the generational shift. The fact is, there's a whole generation of folks coming into the workplace right now who grew up on social media, who grew
Yep.
up telling their story, who are more interested in how they present themselves and staying true to their values than chasing the dollar. That's the data's there. I mean, Deloitte did a
Yep.
whole study,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we know the demands are different coming from there. That's number one. Another one, though, that's a little more controversial is when Friedman wrote, financial capital was scarce. I don't think that's as true anymore. It's not that hard to get. There's a lot of VCs looking for some place to dump their money, right? So when financial capital isn't the scarcest resource anymore, then you move on to the other things like the social capital, like the people. And if the people are switching in values, if the generation's demands are shifting, then all of a sudden that becomes more important. So it's not that Friedman was wrong. I think Friedman was very right in his time. But I think so many things on the ground have changed since then that we need to think about a connected capitalism because we are in an environment where financial capital is flush, where the workforce has higher demands. Here's another one, right? Cities used to compete for factories to be built, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that it's going the other way. So when Amazon tried to push New York
Sure.
said, no, forget it,
Well,
So
not all of New York, but so no, but I think your point on Friedman is interesting. Is the context of at the point he wrote that if the scarcest resource is capital, he was probably right, because it
that's
has
right.
to be used, right? Now, not that you walk down the street and people just throw money at you, but it's not that hard, right, to raise money and capital. So I want to pivot for a minute, David. So we've got this thought leadership, we've got this book, we've got this research, and I love the academic piece because this isn't some goofy made up hypothesis from somebody. There's data underneath this. What's the application? What are the underlying business implications and so if I'm a business person, or if you wanted to take your thought leadership into the business community, how else might you get it out there? Because books, as we know, as a business model, are pretty awful on a good day.
Yeah. We've been doing actually a lot of workshops mostly with higher level folks, because I think the most difficult piece in this is if you accept the notion that meaning, connection, and wonder are important, there's a challenge on where the power of decision making should lay. So when I do these workshops with senior folks, the biggest question I get is, so does that mean, the junior person has as much power as me, the CEO who's worked for decades, right? And the answer is obviously no. But I say it like this. I say the locus of power remains the same, but the nexus is shifting. In other words, all those folks who support your power are becoming more powerful. So does the decision making lie with you? Absolutely. But do you have to listen in a way that maybe you didn't 20 years ago? Also, absolutely. And figuring out that sweet spot where you don't give up on hierarchical structures, but you're empowering everyone in the organization to be themselves, to engage in wonder, to come to the table almost as equals, is really, really challenging. The easy way to put it that I always like to say is we have to move from leadership being a noun to a verb, right? In the old days, it was, I'm the leader. That's what matters. Now it's, I'm leading, right? And that act of leading requires a different type of buy-in and a different type of skill set. So I really think that the hard work here is creating the cultural fit that allows the decision makers with the traditional power to still be the decision makers while creating a space for others in the hierarchy and not going into chaos, which is...
So how much of this is there's a convergence here of sort of the ethos of connected capitalism, as well as living in a time where the not empowered, be that a consumer or be that a newly minted frontline manager, that wouldn't dream of busting into the CEO's office and say, let me tell you what I think, boss, right?
Right.
Because of social and because of all these other things, there's a transparency in the marketplace. And many organizations have been forced to listen louder than they would have liked in the past. Because, you might be a, quote, powerless consumer that got, a bad product, whatever that is. But, you've got 100,000 followers, this, that, and the other thing, and you can cause a ruckus on your local Facebook page or wherever you want.
That's right. It's something we write a lot about on the academic side, my co-author and I, which is that powerlessness is actually an asset. When we say someone's powerless, traditionally powerless means you had no power. Today, the powerless are actually very salient to folks with a lot of power. And understanding that dynamic, it's really interesting because on the one hand, there's a progressive movement that has made power a dirty word.
Sure.
On the other hand, it's really a misnomer because power is still in play. Just it comes from places that you don't necessarily, expect anymore, right? And that's where a lot of companies are making mistakes because they're responding through CSR initiatives, for example, where they think, well, if I throw money at the social issue of the day, then I'm doing the right thing. And that's not good long-term because that's not where your firm's skill set are. That's not where the best allocation of your resources, right?
Well, oftentimes a good deed is perceived as nothing more than what it often is, which is placating. Oh, let's put a little, pink ribbon or, give a few dollars to this and that'll shut up that group or that'll placate them or make them feel like, we're really behind that.
Right.
But that goes back to your point on culture.
That's right. And also, by the way, I think that's what Friedman was critical of, right? When you read Friedman closely, what he was saying is, well, if it's about, placating the loudest voices, then it's really just the whim of the CEO to spend your money on the issue that's got his attention or her attention today, right? And that's not particularly interesting. But if we think about it more broadly and we say, well, how is it that what we do as a firm can actually help these individuals? How can we deploy our resources? Then it becomes more interesting, So like in Canada, we have CIBC, they're in the States too, but CIBC is known for the Run for the Cure, right? Which is this big race that they do for sure. How is their competency tied to running races? It's not, right? If you're a bank and you want to make a difference, use your resources, figure out how to do banking in a way that makes these different communities more satisfied, rather than hosting big deal events that aren't really tied to your core competencies or to your expertise. And that's part of the connected capitalism message, right? Which is, what's the meaning that you find when you go to work? Why do you go to work as a banker? Who are you connecting with? Where's your sense of wonder? Where does that come to? And that forces you to think more deeply about what you do in the day-to-day. And it's not as easy to just write a check and assuage your conscience or the demands of your stakeholders who are putting pressure on you.
So as we start to wrap up here, David, the last sort of thoughts or things I'd love for you to share with us is, so the book comes out, pandemic, all this other stuff going on. How has that been good, bad, or indifferent for you as an author, struggling to get, like as every author is, getting your message out, getting the attention of folks that are attention star, like you're competing now with Netflix and everything else, but anything that's been different from this book as
Yeah,
opposed to your previous book?
I found what's really interesting is there's more of a hunger for it framed as a, how do I rebuild post-pandemic? Like, what's very interesting
Okay.
is people aren't asking those small incremental questions anymore, right? It used to be when you'd go out as a consultant, you're trying to make an existing business model slightly better. Right now, folks
Sure.
are like, I don't know that I'm going back to work. I don't know that I'm opening the office again. I don't know what our product is, right? And when they start to think about rebuilding their business after the pandemic, they're asking the big picture questions that connected capitalism addresses. So sadly, in a way, I think the timing has actually been very fortuitous. And the questions and the engagement we're getting from, business leaders has been really interesting and heartening, that we're at a moment in history, maybe, where we can come out better and stronger as a result of this. At the same time, for a lot of folks, including myself, the pandemic has really made us question the competence of government and other major decision makers,
Sure.
right?
Right.
And almost reminded us of how important business is, because if we can't trust government and public institutions to get us through the crisis, then we do start looking towards the innovations in the private sector. And that's why we need to make sure that we're doing it right.
Well, ultimately, at least here in the States, I mean, where many things have gone well is that place where private enterprise and government interfaces, right? The technology, it wasn't just the money thrown at it, but we've got, Pfizer, Moderna, all these amazing companies doing amazing things. And I think when the history books are written, it's like, wow, they were able to figure that out so quickly. Like, that's pretty cool. Then you
That's
have,
right.
your point, logistics, supply chain. I mean, there's 1,000 other things that went wrong, both here in the States and up in Canada. But history
That's right.
will tell.
Like the pandemic has killed, in my mind, just in time. I think redundancy is going to be the
Yep.
message of the day moving forward, that we can't rely on global supply chains, and we can't rely on that sort of efficiency arguments that we took for granted for decades. And that's a huge, huge shift. The other point that I think is important, though, is, government were a partner, but government also chose the winners and the losers. So coming back to where we
Yep.
started this conversation, the artistic industries have been devastated,
Yeah.
because government hasn't prioritized them and hasn't prioritized. The fact that Broadway is barely reopening now, right, is very problematic, And so thinking about the power to choose winners and losers and making sure that they're the winners and losers we as a society want, and not necessarily the arbitrary ones decided by government policy at a specific point of time in a crisis, is also, I think, important.
Yeah, no, great point, David. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for
best
having
of
me,
luck
Peter.
with everything.
Thank you. Awesome.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.